Welcome to another episode of the Architecture Startup Stories interview series with me, Ryan Gorman, founding director of Lofthouse Group. In this series of interviews, we're speaking to the founders of architecture and design studios who are sharing with us their unique insights into the industry, along with the stories of starting up their own practices. On today's show, we're joined by Ben Powell, who's founder of the London-based architectural practice Studio Manifest and lecturer at the University of Suffolk. Morning, Ben. How are you doing?
Good morning, Ryan. I'm very well, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm really well. Thanks for joining us. I could have given a description of your practice because I've got the benefit of knowing you already. But I suppose for the benefit of the listeners, do you want to just give a brief description of what Studio Manifest is?
Sure. I mean, I guess at our heart, we're an architecture practice, but we're trying to do things a bit differently and challenge the normal conceptions of what an architecture practice is, and look at all elements of how we come together and deliver buildings, develop the built environment, and work with people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. Yeah, definitely a better description than I would have been able to do. So to start with, I'd really like to have a chat about you, Ben, the person behind the practice, and what really led you to the decision to start up your own studio. Everyone's motivation seems to be really different, but I suppose going right back to when you first joined the profession, or even before that, what was it that attracted you to the architecture profession, to becoming an architect in the first place?
I mean, it's diversity, really. Architecture is this incredible subject which sort of spans everything, really. You know, it's an engineering subject, it's a maths and a science at one end, and it's a social. Then it becomes a social science somewhere in the middle, where it sort of blurs between engineering and art, and then it really is an art practice on the other end of things. And when I first went to architecture school, that kind of blew my mind. I was probably a bit more maths orientated, a bit more of a practical person. And then I sort of get presented with these concepts and theories, and you go there thinking I'm going to learn to draw buildings and stuff like this, and then I'll go out and just draw buildings for a living, and then you realise that it's just so much richer and so much more extraordinary than that. And yeah, to be honest, I guess I went to architecture school, thinking one thing, and then actually found something much more incredible. And it's really, as a person, I would say, and from school up to who I am now, I think the profession of architecture has helped me really grow and see the world in a different way. So,
is there anything in particular that jumps out when you say that?
In what respect? In anything specific about architecture school, or about?
No, that anything that when you say that it gives you a different perspective on things, is it the way you view a building, or the way you view a society, or what types of things jump out at you now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is about people, really. And I'll come back when we delve into the practice a bit more. We'll probably sort of address that in a bit more directly. But the key thing is about people. At the heart of every decision you make is people. If we're talking from an engineering perspective, everyone, it's one thing to make a building stand up. It's another thing to make it a place where people want to be, and where people want to be long term, and not just where they want to be, where the things that all of us want. Sort of, there's the basic functions, warmth, dry, etc., but then there's so many more emotive things, happiness, sadness, all these kind of things that you live out through architecture. I forget who it was the quote's from, but architecture is the stage against which we play out our everyday lives. And it's so true, really. And if you think about everything that goes on in your life, and everything that we do on a day-to-day basis, and everything that we need to do, and all the functions that we need in our families, and our all of this stuff, all of that is wrapped up into the design of a building. So yeah, you quickly realize when you delve into the topic that it's so much more than just sort of putting some bricks together.
It must be more in the forefront of the kind of the non-architect, like in the mind of the non-architect these days with the pandemic. I mean, for myself, I haven't appreciated going into an office as much as now, when I haven't been able to go into an office or go out to see. I've been stuck in a home office for quite a while, and whilst I've done everything I can to make it as an enjoyable a place to be, I can certainly appreciate now that architecture and the building, even just from my own personal experience of being frustrated and feeling like I've got cabin fever locked in a room. I'm sure if I was an architect, I'd know what to do to improve that. Do you have any? Have you experienced this yourself, having worked from home? And do you have any advice for anyone who is currently working from home on things they can do in their office to make it a little bit more bearable?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think we all have. For me, the big hit was about creativity. Quite, it's a creative discipline, and where I found that, well, I discovered through lockdown that creativity comes through the diversity, through meeting people, through seeing new things, through, without wanting to sound too kind of, I don't know, too ostentatious or something like that. Walking through light and seeing different lights hit you, you don't even realize it's happening at the time, but afterwards that you think about something a different way, or just different perspectives and things, and things that you're doing in your everyday life like that really have an influence in the way that you work. And I found quite the first couple of months of lockdown last year quite enjoyable. Get home, get on with some work, be at home a bit more, get some things done that you haven't done for a while. And slowly I found my productivity dropping. And some of the things I really enjoy doing, exercise, for example, or reading or drawing, not doing them anymore, no motivation. So what worked for me was to make sure I realized that this was a kind of lack of stimulation, effectively. So I started to, within the confines of the government's rules, of course.
You get that and make sure you state that first. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, that's my disclaimer in. Within the confines of the rules, making sure I got my stimulation outside, going out for walks, whatever it might be. Bike rides are great. Going to see things, making that part of the schedule and making sure it stays in the schedule. Yeah.
Because I think that after this, I don't think that the working from home is going to be a thing of the past. I think it's going to be, from what I'm seeing from speaking to other studios, is that it's going to become very much an integrated part of working life now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the space we're in at the moment, this is we've just taken up some space in a new workspace actually in Lavington Street near London, well, near the Tate, actually, sustainable workspaces. And the sort of rationale or the idea we're following is that we're going to be in here 2 to 3 days a week and at home a couple of days a week. And that just gives us that opportunity to have that face time, to see the rest of the team. Certainly, when you're trying to share creative ideas, doing that through the medium of scanned PDFs or whatever, markups on the internet or Teams or Zoom or whatever we're on, is very, very difficult. Sometimes you need to just sort of gesticulate and wave your arms about, or get the pad and paper out and talk around a table. And particularly with architects, I mean, architecture schools are based on the École de Beaux-Arts sort of principles, which is, I mean, perhaps some might argue it's a bit outdated, but basically it's a studio principle, and it's a principle where everyone works. When you're a student, you're working on live projects, and you're doing that round a table with other people. And so you're solving problems as a team together, using models, using sketching, you're using your hands and you're there in the place, and you're stealing ideas off one another, and you're having to deal with the environment of team working effectively. And so to just suddenly sort of pull that rug from out for you means that, our kind of base understanding of how to approach professional practice is removed.
Do you think that being able to adapt to those changes is easier as a smaller studio? And do you think that ability to adapt quickly impacts on the ability to then deliver on projects?
Well, it's interesting. I think there's two sides to the coin. I think if you're a larger studio, you have the resources and you have the setup for the practical elements to be more flexible. We really struggled with, I set up the practice, got a small, I was saying early on about server issues, IT issues, and sort of moving those home has been a nightmare, and kind of negotiating that has been tricky. But in terms of, from a social perspective and our ability to adapt, I guess, yeah, I'd say it has. And I actually think, we're one of the companies that have actually grown during lockdown. I think largely because of that, because, we can operate on different mediums. We aren't fixed to a certain structural sort of operational process. And yeah, there's two sides to the coin, really.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to come back and we're going to chat in more detail about Studio Manifest and your professional practice, but really interested to, let's go back to, we've talked about how Ben Powell got into being an architect or wanting to be an architect, but I'm really interested in hearing, I suppose, the story up to the point where you started your first day as Studio Manifest. Can you talk me through your career, your experiences, and what ultimately gave you the confidence and led you to the decision to start your own practice?
Yeah, well, I guess I've got to, I don't want to, without wanting to go too far down memory lane, I've probably got to go back to my part one.
Yeah.
I went to Brighton for my part one, came out with some, all right A levels, sort of ABC, nothing particularly special. I always did okay at school, but was never really had a focus. And I got into Brighton through clearing. Actually, Brighton turned out to be a pretty decent school, which has actually grown and become more well established in the last 2 years. But I went there with, as I was just sort of talking about, a different, not really a true impression of what architecture was, and not really understanding it. But found something that had great reach in which we could go in different directions. So it took me the first sort of 3 years. I would say my part one was really just me getting to grips with what architecture was and how you balance the art and the science that we did, that we discussed there. I didn't do that until I got out into practice. Actually, I went to work for a company called Butler Hegarty Architects. They specialised. It was a small practice, and have probably had quite a lot of influence in the way I see architecture. It was a practice I really loved being at. I was there for almost, either side of my part two, I was there for almost 8 years in total. And it was there that I really understood, because we're delivering projects and we're still getting to that finished thing. I really sort of got to grips with this thing about how you think conceptually about space, how you approach challenges of people, place, context in a sort of genuine and meaningful way, that you're actually moving towards a sort of a proposal. And so, yeah, I think there is where I really cut my teeth and sort of blossomed, if you like, into myself as an architect. I then went back to Oxford Brookes for part two with a much clearer idea about what it was to study. I had the drawing skills. I sort of negotiated drawing and found a bit of my own style and an efficient way of working through, because that's part of the process. Just know when you've got an idea, working out the best way to represent it on paper is something that we all do differently anyway. Some people love the computer element of it, some people hand draw. You need to bring them all together at some point. So I found a method, I found a way of doing that. And I learned to sort of study, and I learned to explore the architectural world. So I went back to part two really kind of motivated, if you like. It was actually during that period as well, I started working with an architecture practice, charity called Architecture Sans Frontières, the UK branch of Architecture Sans Frontières. And so that showed me ways of engaging in sort of wider social issues, but with particularly kind of people-centered, with a people-centered focus on that, and also bigger issues such as sustainability, environmentalism, but really about putting people first in that context. So I went back to part two, really motivated, really up for it. Had a great time at Brookes. Really had a great time. Really loved it. Came out of that quite well. Did a master's off the back of that, and that's when I went off into practice. And then I think a bit more time about Hegarty. I had some time at Lipton Plant Architects for 2 or 3 years, which were quite a different. So I went from somewhere which was, I was very aware that it was a small practice, both focused on conservation. And I would say that the things I loved about the firm were the fact that as a small team, we were very collaborative. We could work together. I got a good oversight of projects, so you weren't isolated. We weren't pigeonholed into certain areas. I think I learned my craft into the detailing and getting into the detailing of buildings. Then I went to Lips and Plant, which were a bit bigger, about 20. They sort of grew from about 12 to 20 people while I was there. More commercially minded, but very creative. And there I kind of where Butler Hegarty were perhaps not thinking so conceptually and so creative, and not really thinking about contemporary architecture so much. Lips and Plant were very driven by that. So I brought together this idea of detailing and kind of contemporary commercial practice. Yeah, and so it was after that point that I kind of felt like I had got to a point in my career where I'd brought these two sides together and felt like I was, I was an architect, really.
Was there any particular moment that made you think, because being an architect and I guess having the security of being an employed architect is quite different to taking that risk of setting up yourself and having to find your own work. Was there a particular point where you suddenly realized you had the confidence, not just in your own architectural ability, but to be able to go out and get projects as well?
Well, I was probably a bit naive about it back then. But when we were at Lips and Plant, one of the things I admired, but there was John and Ed, the directors there. One of the things I admired about them the most was the way they'd set up this practice from after their parts 2, I think, part 2 or part 3, but very early on, straight after they qualified. And they'd grown it from the 2 of them to these sort of 12 to 20 people. And they sort of, they were over £1 million turnover a couple of years before I left. So, they'd done that within about eight years or so. So, and I admired the way that they had this business model and that it was based on a kind of creative process. And it wasn't just sort of, I sort of had some association with a lot of our larger architectural practices through kind of various channels. And found that the commercial process had kind of sucked a lot of the design emphasis out of their work and made the work very siloed. So it was great. And that wasn't the case at Lips and Plant. But I did think, but at the time, as I was sort of grew into project architect, I was managing multiple projects and thought, I could do this. Well, all I've got to do is find these clients. And otherwise, I'm kind of managing it myself, really. So, how difficult could it be? When I actually did go and do it myself, I realized how difficult it can be. And, kudos to them for it all. But, it did give me a good, I think the base skills for running a practice I picked up there.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because you're a lecturer as well at the University of Suffolk. Obviously there's the part 3 course, but is there enough done? I've had a chat with this about with one of my previous guests, Simon Goldstein at Goldstein Heather, and we chatted about the part 3 course preparing you for life in practice. But is there anything? Do you think universities teach students how to go out and win work, or is it just about the actual being an architect part of it? And could we be doing more?
Really interesting one, that one. The simple answer to the question is absolutely not, particularly not at part 1. They don't really address the practice of architecture at all. And I guess one of the big drivers for me around starting at the university was a kind of a challenge to challenge that. All of that stuff really is left to you part 3. So the kind of traditional architecture school, the RIBA process in the UK at least, and I actually think the RIBA process in the UK is better than some of the models on the continent, but the RIBA process in the UK is that you do your 3 years, go out to study and get work experience. And then you come back for 2 years and you go out to study and get work experience. I would say that those 24 months you get the work experience is the only time is where a lot of that professional practice stuff is left to. You've got 5 years in education and it's very kind of focused on design and developing design. Now there's certainly more, well, when I was at university, I've been out of uni about 10 years now, but the sustainability element was sort of creeping in and was there when I was there, but was not really integrated as much as it is now. Obviously, that's a kind of much more of a driver in the universities now. But in terms of actually professional practice, which is, in my eyes, issues such like finance and money and resourcing and this kind of stuff are the biggest barriers to proper sort of sustainable integration. But you learn about sustainability, we learn about how to detail buildings and avoid cold bridges and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and what is sustainability in terms of a contextual approach and everything else. But little of that is related back to this idea about sort of finance and cost and things like this. And that is, and when you go out in the real world, you quite quickly realize that it's the big, especially if it's working with commercial practices, the first question they ask is, that's all great, but how much is it going to cost? So, I mean, sort of, it's a tricky, it's a complex question about how you do that with students. But certainly one of my approaches from the approach at the University of Suffolk is trying to readdress that balance a little bit, maintain what is an essential. I mean, architects and creativity is our core skill as architects, problem solvers, and approaching a site, a building, a city, a town, or even just a group of people, identifying a series of problems, defining a brief that deals with those problems, and coming up with a solution that others might not be able to think of. That is our core value, right? But you've got to be able to do that. So you need to maintain that within that training process. You don't want to lose that. That's really, really important. But at the same time, you've got to have some realism about it and some kind of ability to address the commercial. I mean, I keep using the word commercial, but it's unavoidable. Architectural practice, like any practice, we've got to put food on the table. And especially now, I see it even more now. I've got employees, and I've got a team, and we've got officers, and we've got something has to pay for all these things in order to deliver the sustainable ideologies that we're hoping for. So you've got to be commercial savvy. So we're trying to address that a little bit with some of the things we're doing at the university.
I think that's a good idea. I might be opening a can of worms here by saying this, but it seems there's a big topic at the minute, right, which is about Part 2's working overtime for free and whether they should be doing it or whether they shouldn't. And I suppose I don't know whether necessarily there's an answer to this, but are people trained on how to win business or win clients based on value rather than on cost? Because I get the impression that perhaps, a lot of the feedback I've had from people in the industry about why they're having to work a lot of overtime for free is because of incorrectly costed projects or winning projects based on charging low fees rather than the value that they can add, which ultimately becomes. And look, it's an issue that plagues the recruitment industry as well, and it ends up being a race to the bottom, and it's not good for the entire industry. Do you think people are taught to win projects based on value rather than on cost?
Oh gosh, yeah, it's a big question. The simple answer is probably no. I don't think they are, but not directly anyway. I think that, and there's an interesting sort of subject matter in there, isn't it, about architecture is, because it's such a wide-reaching topic and it can mean so many things and can practice in so many different ways. The education system has to allow for all of that scope in some respects. So we can't be too focused on, here's a strategy for winning, added value for commercial clients, doing high rise in the city or something like that. And the high rise building is going to be very different from a sort of, small scale developer with, houses. And so so no is on that, in that respect. But I do think that the creative process that you go through as architects does address that in a more subtle way. Certainly, in architecture school, there's lots of things, there's lots of mechanisms in place that help to encourage students to think creatively about the way that they develop and subsequently present their projects. For example, we have crits all through the year, and if you have a crit, we have crits and pinups and all these kind of things. And I know there's a kind of a joke about, oh, everyone's going to get slammed and it's going to be this horrible thing, and every architecture student dreads the crit. And to some extent, it's true, but on the other side of things, it's actually a great process to go through, because you get a series of people identifying different needs, different things, raising different agendas that they might have on a project. And I think that for students helps them kind of find the things that they're interested in, gravitate towards their own sector, which they can start focusing on, and set them on these challenges about representing value. What is that, and questioning what is value and whose value are we talking about?
Well, on that topic of value, I know that Studio Manifest, you set up the practice with a set of values, specific values in mind, and problems you wanted to address. Well, let's move on to when you set up the studio. Day one, you sat at your desk, all excited because you're director of your own studio. Talk me through that first day.
Well, I mean, I'm going to go back a few weeks from the first days. We've got lots of values, and I'll tell you about where we are now. But the genuine reason why I set up the practice in the first place was because I was in a job I wasn't enjoying. I had a private client, and I thought, oh, sod this. I'm going to quit. I'm going to give up this job. I've got enough money to sustain myself for a while, and let's see what comes of it. And if nothing else, I'll be able to have some income while I find a new job. What I actually found was, when I set up my own practice, as well as having most of the core skills there to sort of at least run jobs and work with clients and get some of those core skills there, that I was able to challenge. I wasn't sort of constrained by the framework of the practice, and I was able to challenge some of those norms, and that was really exciting. And suddenly, all these things we've been talking about sustainability, about value adding, I could actually approach in a sort of unblinkered way. And that's when I started to think, and that's when I really realized that actually I've got an opportunity here to establish something which could be a bit different, which could challenge the normal ways of doing things, and maybe we can actually start to address some of these things I've been learning in architecture school, but some of the things which I'm finding it very difficult to implement through the practice life that I have found myself in. Yeah. So I guess the first thing was about the first challenge. I'm there on day one. I've got a project, and actually it's sort of day one was kind of quite easy, really, because I've already got a project. I'm working. I've got a bit of money coming in, and there's just infinite possibilities of what it can do. Then I realized, this, like, sort of things start ticking forward. I'm getting practice names, setting up websites, trying to sort of really sort of ruminating on a business plan. And then the next thing is, well, actually, I've got to get some more work. So then the next thing is, oh my God, so where does the next job come from? And then that was like the big sort of first roadblock that you hit. How do I actually get new work? I've seen everyone else do it, but actually, I know that job came through a friend of a friend of a friend. So it's like, right, okay, networking. Let's try and build up a network. Yeah. And so that was my first port of call, really, is trying to establish a network. And actually, that process of networking, then again, sort of came back into my own practice. So I started to work with other people who were doing similar things. I worked with some builders, for example. I'd worked before. One of the builders was setting up his own practice, his own building company, construction company. So we sort of started to collaborate on a couple of projects, do some bids together as a kind of builder developer team. And suddenly I was like, okay, this is interesting. Not only are we sort of exploring new work, I'm really challenging the way that you go about and explore, you find that work. And so that collaborative practice has actually grown to be a kind of core thing that Studio Manifest are about, really.
Yeah, I can imagine that suddenly having to find work can be a tricky or a daunting prospect that a lot of people probably don't necessarily think about as much when they start up a practice. So you, I guess somebody who is setting up a practice now, who's decided to dive. Actually, and let me rephrase this: if you were starting up the practice now, how different do you think it would be versus like 2-3 years ago?
It depends on what was happening. How different would it be compared to 3 years ago? I mean, in some respects, I don't know if it would be any different. I think you've still got the same core challenges. I guess if I knew what I knew now, I might be less inclined to start up the practice, which would be a real shame. I think it depends where you're coming from and what sort of person you are. I am someone who learns through doing. I am not, I like to take educated risks. You know, I'm not kind of adverse. I'm not risk adverse as such, although I don't want my clients to think I'm, running around not thinking about their projects. But, I don't mind trying something new, shall we say. And I had nothing to lose when I set the practice up. So in that respect, if I did that again now and I was in the same circumstance, then I don't know if it would be too much different. I think if I guess I'm a bit older now, a bit more settled in sort of, in life. I haven't got got a partner, but not full family. And, if I was further down that road, it would certainly be more of a challenge. And I would want to have some of those clients and infrastructure in place earlier on. I think because I went and did it quite early, I wasn't on. One thing is, I guess if you're on a director's salary and you're living in a house on that kind of salary with a family to support, then you need to make sure you've got X amount of money coming in to do all those things. I didn't have those challenges, so I was relatively relatively free and easy in that respect. So, it certainly definitely depends on your own circumstances. It was only where are we now? It was only just over three years ago that the practice was formally set up, and about 2.5 years ago that I've been doing it full time. So I don't think that the world has. I know that obviously the COVID, the last year has been a kind of a challenging thing, and I guess if you were setting up in COVID, that'd be a different thing altogether. But assuming that world's going to go back to normal, I don't think that. I guess I would like to say to any young architects who feel that they, that's something they want to do, then why not give it a go? Our architectural training is very comprehensive. We study for a minimum of 7 years. You've got practice experience in amongst that. You've got professional training. We do learn about a broad range of things. Putting it into practice is very difficult and it's different, and it's you've got a chance. But I wouldn't want to put off any aspiring practice directors or people from setting up their own practice, because for me personally, it's been the best thing I ever did.
Oh, awesome. Well, one thing I did want to ask you specifically about the practice is I know sustainability is a focus. For the benefit of the listeners, can you talk a bit about Studio Manifest's approach to sustainability and how you're implementing it into your projects and your practice?
Well, there's two sides of it, really. I think there's the technical side of things. The government targets are for 2050 for zero carbon, but I think we're all fairly realistic. Well, I think I haven't met any architects who don't think that target is not ambitious. That target is lacks ambition, so I say. And in Suffolk, a lot of local authorities, and Suffolk is one of them, are actually working towards 2030. So, there is the technical element. The building regs are being updated regularly. I just think generally as a society, people are much more aware, much more savvy, and much more on board with the idea of lowering carbon emissions. So there's that technical side which we're doing, and but I think every practice is really, you can't not be. The only thing I would say is I do think a lot of established older practices struggle to break free from the normal ways of sort of detailing, constructing buildings. Once the bigger the practice, I found, the more like a sort of the more process driven they are, and the more sort of changing a technique or changing material struggles. I think once you go from, architecture practice is pretty good with that, but builders, once you get into the construction industry, they're even more resistant to it. They're onto a good thing. But large scale developers, they're onto a good thing. They're making money. They don't want change. Change is risk for them, big risk. So there's the sustainability element. We're quite small. We found it very easy to incorporate those things. I don't know any small practices our size who aren't sort of in technical environmental sustainability who aren't integrating that. And I think starting from the smaller scale, working with, collaborating with contractors, with craftspeople, with communities, with all this sort of stuff. That is how we are sort of growing these things up into sort of more mainstream stuff. And that's really where I think that our collaborative, that's where our sort of sustainability is perhaps a little bit unique. I mean, is that really, for me, it's a focus on people. And I think if you put people first rather than just the sort of the environmental aspect of it, it's actually relatively easy to create sort of walls, floors and roofs that are with low U values. And now that products and processes are being more and more mainstreamed and more commercially produced, the cost of those things is coming down rapidly. So I actually think that technical side is sort of being dealt with. I think the thing that the disconnect often is the technology, bringing it back to architecture and creativity and design and all those things that I've been banging on about for the last half an hour or how long we've been here, which is about context, people and place. Yeah. And so that is where we're really trying to approach it from. We really context, very, very much about context specific architecture. For every project we have a manifesto, and it's a sort of unique brief which is derived for the place that we're at and for the people that we're working with. So it's very much about our clients, and it might be as simple as if it's a commercial client we're working with, it might be as simple as what's their long-term business plan, what's their strategy, and how do we create a kind of concept or a brief which is going to help them realize that. And if we come up with a really cool creative concept, actually we can add value to their scheme by, I don't know, let's say it's a block of flats, and we have looked at the history of the area and we've come up with a concept for the scheme. Well, that's their marketing done straight away, isn't it? The market, we've got a, I won't, not without being specific about any project. If we've got this really interesting, lively project and we've got some interesting design element and it stands out from other buildings in the area, then that is adding value to that company. So I think, we're looking at sustainability not just from a technical mindset, but trying to look at the sort of triple bottom line, if you like, which is the financial side of things, the environmental side of things, and then placing a big emphasis on the social side of things, because actually proper sustainability only works if people are buying into it, if you make good places and good spaces.
And do you think being a small practice makes it easier for you to offer better solutions to clients?
100%. And it's one of the things I kind of ruminate on as we're growing, how we kind of maintain those, how we maintain that really. Being with a couple of, I've never really worked in a massive multinational corporation, but I've been in a couple of larger practices, sort of 70 people or so, and upwards. And I found that they struggled with, of course, they had a lot of processes. They had their ISO 14001, and they had all of their sustainable things in line. But it takes a long time to develop those systems and develop those working practices, and they there's something that gets reviewed every few years, and you're doing dozens of projects a year, and every project's unique. So how do you adapt in that situation? So it's an interesting one, because on the one hand, we only really tackle big climate issues if we do it at scale. It's such a massive thing that we've got to deal with. So we need scale. But on the other hand, we need to be specific and, and address things on a kind of a very local level. So I do think as a small practice, we're much more flexible and much more adaptive to these things, and can really, and we are with our own practice, bringing in new ideologies, new technologies, new ideas, new way of doing things. We've got lots of opportunities for doing that, but it's the issue of scale and how we make a difference on a big thing. So it's not something I've quite come to the solution of, but it's something we're very aware of.
Well, could you give me an overview now? We've talked about Manifest as you've set it up. Give me an overview of, and for the listeners, what Studio Manifest is now and what the future is for the practice.
Okay, so right now we're a small team. We're focused primarily on housing, to be honest. I think housing is something I'm quite passionate about. It's generally something I find quite engaging, because it's much more, I find it a bit more tactile. You're putting yourself in the space, rather than sort of office commercial kind of things where you're really thinking about the space as an open area and a shell that's going to live through various life cycles. With housing, you're thinking much more about the people that are going to be there. So I like that kind of tactility that it brings. But I mean, the big issue really is that in the UK we've got a housing crisis, which is just getting broader and broader. We're conservative estimates demonstrate that we need to build like 350,000 houses a year, and we've only been getting about half that at best for the last decade or so. So and that everyone's aware. I think this is very much become much more of a political issue, but nonetheless, the sort of policies and processes in place are very, very slow and difficult to adapt. So I think as a practice, that's a core thing we're trying to address. We're definitely starting at a small scale and doing that, looking at single one-off houses and kind of developments, sort of 5 to 10. But it is a nice way, it is a very tangible way to hone the practice and look at different ways. Through doing that, we're very much able to, we've been integrating lots of offsite construction methods as an example, prefab of SIPS panel systems, insulated concrete form. We're exploring all these different avenues. Actually, during this in the summer, we're doing something with a research organization called Cobbars, looking at this cob process that they're using on a I say commercial, small scale single house at the moment, but they're trying to develop that in a commercial way by bringing down times on site, drying times, making it fit in with a typical program of construction. So yeah, as a practice, that's a big thing, and that's a big thing we're influencing. And I think the way that we're doing that is through our link, particularly with our link with academia. As you mentioned, I'm a lecturer in architecture at the University of Suffolk, and that's really helping us keep a foot in both sides. I think there is this. I think that's one of the we were talking before about sort of training for young architects. I think that one of the big issues is that we are the architectural profession. We have CPDs and things, but CPDs, very much sort of like a designer or a company who's put it together. They come in and basically tell you about their new product, and it's good. It's not, it's good to. It does encourage us to grow, but I don't think it really encourages us to think outside the box very much. It's sort of a new. It's like it's a new finish to an existing sort of system, really. So I think as part of our work, we're really trying to integrate research and integrate that. New practice and new ways of thinking.
Awesome. Is there anything? So you've been running the practice for 2.5 years full time. Have you? I guess if somebody is at that same point that you were at 2.5 years ago, and they're thinking of either, well, they're either thinking of moving practice or they're thinking of giving it a go themselves, what would be the biggest piece of advice you'd have for someone thinking of starting up their own practice now?
Well, I mean, I suppose the first thing is, as I've said, find some work. Where are you going to get some work from? I mean, I've done it. I've spoken to a lot of architects about it. You know, the first few years, it's really just like, where's the next job coming from and how we're going to. But I think you do need to have some kind of plan and some kind of strategy. You know, for us, it's about continuing to be creative and continuing to challenge the way things are done and looking for new ways of practicing. You know, we've got to sort of, actually, one of the challenges for us is kind of keeping those within a framework that's manageable on a day-to-day basis. But, you know, we're looking at how we procure drawings and work. We want to integrate BIM systems, but we don't want them to overshadow our creativity. We're looking at bringing in new technologies and sustainable materials and things like this, but we want to make sure that our projects are sort of financially viable and that it doesn't impact our time frame too much. So, but you know, we have got our plan. We've got a clear strategy, I think, about research and practice and challenging practice, putting people at the center of that. And in terms of what we're kind of aiming to do, you know, as I said, we've sort of grown from doing single one-off dwellings to slightly larger, you know, 5 to 10 units, working with just private homeowners to small-scale developers. The next challenge is to sort of grow that slightly more to slightly wider arm. We'd really love to be working with local authorities, which is, you know, working your way through framework agreements and things like this is a super challenge, and it's something that we haven't quite kind of had the chance. We haven't really got too involved with. All that said, that you know, our research and the stuff we're doing with the University of Suffolk is opening some of those doors. So I would say have a strategy, but be adaptable is probably the key thing I'd say to anyone starting up their own business. You definitely need to have some idea about what you want to do and how, you know, put together your business plan, but it only needs, you know, but don't think it needs to be this sort of 50-page document with all of this sort of set ideology, because there'll be so many spanners in the work. You need to be adaptable and you need to be ready to change. And that's one of the advantages we discussed of being a small practice.
Awesome. And if somebody is interested in finding out more about Studio Manifest, where can they look to find that information about you guys?
They can go to our website, www.studiomanifest.co.uk. What you can see, they get links to our Instagram accounts and things like that on there. I'd also probably direct them towards University of Suffolk. We are doing lots of sort of collaborations with them. So to go to the University of Suffolk and look for the architecture course, you'll see a bit of bio about me, but there's also sort of regular updates about projects we're running. Something we're working on at the moment. At the end of the summer, we're going to be involved in a festival back in Ipswich called Spills, where we're going to be in collaboration with the University of Suffolk and the RIBA East, going to be building a cob oven. We're using sort of, but trying to the kind of the build process will be this idea of challenging sort of traditional and contemporary practices to kind of build this oven. And then at the end, we're going to have a massive feast. It's going to be about 200 people. There's going to be different communities from around Ipswich coming in, and we're going to be cooking a feast. Everyone can come and get involved in that.
Amazing. The only bit I could help with is the eating the food bit. Sorry, I had to come in with a cheesy line there.
Well, you're invited.
I don't know if you've seen any of I've started doing some of those sped up drawings on LinkedIn. I did one the other day, and it's I can just about manage stick men and 2D houses. So I guess you have to start somewhere. To finish up before I let you go, final question I like to ask everybody is, what important topic is there in architecture that not enough people are talking about at the minute?
Oh, interesting. What important topic in architecture is there that not enough people are talking about at the minute? Well, I think for me, it's about access to housing. I think people are talking about it at a top level, but not really exploring or developing their thinking on how to do that in a meaningful way. Homelessness numbers are going through the roof. It's very easy to it's very easy to blame all manner of different rationales for why that is, but ultimately housing has to play a part in that. I think the sort of the lack of available affordable housing is a huge driver, particularly in the UK, where we're all about home ownership. It's a huge driver in sort of increasing the disparity between rich and poor. And it isn't just it's got to a point now where it isn't just the poorest people who can't afford to housing. It's people coming out of universities with degrees. You need to you've got to. It's not until you're a few rungs up the ladder when you can afford to get sort of decent housing. So there's lots of. I feel like there's a lot of lip service about that, perhaps, may I say. It's quite opinionated, but there's not enough sort of meaningful action in addressing it.
Good. That's good to know. Hopefully there'll be a follow-up video on a topic like that.
Yeah.
Well, Ben,
you can actually see one of our projects for the Eco Lab, which we're doing with the University of Suffolk, which is design a sort of sustainable home exemplar. If you go to our website, you can see some of the research that we've been doing with that project, and it's, as well as it being sort of zero carbon, our kind of slant on was to try and was to make it an affordable house, basically. So it's a 2-bedroom affordable house and a model that could be replicated. So if you go to our website and look on the research tab, you can see some of the research documents we've been publishing and kind of talks we've been doing on that, and some of the ways we're trying to challenge that area of the architecture.
Great. And for anybody listening, or for anyone who's watching this on YouTube, I'll make sure that I link all of the places Ben's just mentioned, websites, Instagrams. I'll make sure that I add them to the description of the YouTube video, so you can just click there to check them out. But Ben, thanks so much for coming on the show today. It's been really enjoyable, and hopefully we'll have you on again sometime soon.
Pleasure. It's nice to have these conversations. It's the sort of thing that it's harder to do in lockdown, just sort of chat, shoot the breeze about your thoughts about things, and there's always different sparks that come up from that. So really nice to talk to you, Ryan. Thanks for having me on.